I'm with Nirupama Rao, India's former foreign secretary from 2009 to 11. She has also been, previous to that, ambassador to China, to the US, and to Sri Lanka, and has written a book on India-China relations called The Fractured Himalaya, said to be widely acknowledged to be a most perceptive examination of the relationship. But today we are talking about the crisis in Ukraine. Russia invaded Ukraine just under a week ago. One Indian student, Naveen SG of Karnataka, has been very unfortunately killed, and the war has been brought home to India. But before I continue, Ms. Rao, welcome to ThePrint.
Thank you so much, Jyoti. Wonderful to be back on the program with you. Thank you.
So, ma'am, your first comments on the killing of this young medical student, the 21-year-old student in Kharkiv in Western Ukraine, which is one of the hottest sites of where the fighting is taking place between Russian and Ukrainian forces, and how India has been plunged headlong into this crisis, although India has been quite careful so far not to take sides. Your first comments.
Well, Jyoti, the news from Kharkiv has been just devastating. And particularly the fact that this young 21-year-old student, who is from Karnataka, the state where I presently reside, it's so unfortunate. He seems to have gone out to do some groceries and was caught in some shelling. We hear these kind of accounts from war zones. I remember, back in 1973, during the Arab-Israeli war, one of our well-known dancers, Usha Chetur, was killed like that in a shell attack while she was sheltering at that moment. But be that as it may, I really don't know what the sequence of events was leading to the death of the student. I've heard from other accounts that curfew has been imposed in a number of Ukrainian cities, and nobody is allowed to come out, even if it's for an emergency. God knows really what happened. Be that as it may, it's so tragic that we lost this young life. What else can one say? And I think there are many more Indian students, many of them who went to Ukraine to study medicine, who are now stranded in war-torn areas of Ukraine, wanting to get out. The government is doing its best to try and get them out. More than 1,000 students, I believe, have been rescued, have been airlifted back to safety in India so far. But still, there is more to be accomplished as far as this is concerned. This is obviously occupying the main focus of the attention of the government, quite rightfully, because in all that we do abroad, the safety and security of Indian nationals, wherever they are, is of utmost priority.
Absolutely. Now, Ambassador Rao, like you said, this is of priority, the evacuation of Indian nationals. But my question to you is that this is not India's war. I mean, Russian troops or Russia or the Ukraine didn't ask India whether in the run-up to the crisis or whether in the run-up to the war itself about India's views on what should or shouldn't be. So do you think that India should intervene in some way, or do you feel that India should remain disengaged and take a hands-off this position?
Well, anything that involves the human condition anywhere, I think, should affect all of us, because we're essentially one community of man or woman anywhere in the world. But as far as intervention is concerned, obviously it would be unrealistic for me or anyone else to suggest that India should intervene in this conflict. Yes, it definitely is not India's war or a war of India's making. And it's also located in Europe, quite distant from India. It's not in our neighborhood. But the fact is that we just spoke of the students stranded in Ukraine. We are speaking of two countries with which we have had very close relations, especially Russia, and before that, the Soviet Union, and when Ukraine was a part of the Soviet Union. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the formation of the independent country of Ukraine, we have diplomatic ties with Ukraine. We have a fairly good relationship with that country. So we have two countries who we know quite well, now engaged in a conflict with each other. And we don't know what the eventualities of this struggle will lead to. So there is an element of uncertainty there. And, as far as intervention is concerned, obviously, as I said, it's not India's war. But the fact is that war anywhere, and especially in this case, a war that was essentially not a chronicle foretold. I think we all understood that Russia had some very, very serious security concerns about Ukraine's future and what Ukraine wanted to do as far as closer integration with the European community was concerned. Yes, all those concerns had been well articulated by Russia, particularly by President Putin. We are all aware of that, and we have a close relationship. Our Prime Minister has a close relationship with Mr. Putin. I'm sure he must have been told of what these concerns were. But to my knowledge, I'm not aware whether the fact that Russia would cross the international border into Ukraine was really something within our sphere of knowledge, because I assume if that was what we were aware of, we would have in fact forewarned, for instance, our students much earlier that you have to get out because the situation is going to deteriorate and things are going to go from bad to worse. Obviously, right. No country really had that kind of signaling. So it's a unfortunate conflict, and the fact that the international border has been crossed and the whole question, the issue of the violation of Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty comes up. The sovereign will of the Ukrainian people to be independent, to defend their territory, is what we are seeing unfold before our very eyes today. And that is truly dramatic and truly meriting of closer attention from all of us. And perhaps this is an evolving situation. And in that sense, our stand also has to take into account these factors in this emergent situation.
Right. Now, ma'am, when I use the word intervene or intervention, I didn't obviously mean that India should send troops. And anyway, obviously you can't. I mean, this is not your war or our war or India's war. But the fact is that should India say much more, and India has abstained twice at the UN Security Council. But I really want to talk a little bit about your tweets. You've been very, very eloquent in your tweeting these last couple of days. And you have described Russia's actions as imperial overreach. The global order is being upended, you say, all because of the flawed hubris of a leader who has let down what has always been a great nation, Russia. Now, these are strong words, aren't they, about President Putin?
Well, that is my personal viewpoint. And let me place it in the larger context. A lot has been said about Russia's aspirations today. Now, Russia is no doubt a great nation. I've always been a huge admirer of the Russian people, of Russian history, of Russia, the epic nature of what Russia is as a country. There's that. As far as that is concerned, please don't question my attitude or my outlook on Russia. But what we've seen today, and even during Soviet times, I think their leadership, Soviet leadership, spoke, yes, of nationalist aspirations of the Russian people, but they also understood the nationalist aspirations of the constituents of the Soviet Union within the larger unity of what constituted the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. But now with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and we saw the collapse of that huge nation, constituency, let us say, of republics, there's no doubt the residual, the misgivings and the feelings of alienation, deprivation that still rest among perhaps significant sections of the Russian elite, particularly. We're all aware of that, and how this is going to shape the course of events in Europe has always been a question. And I think from the Western side, as far as the Western European countries were concerned, and the United States particularly, the manner in which Russia was treated over the years, or the outlook on how to advance the European narrative or agenda within what was previously part of the Soviet Union was very consciously put forward and activated in the last 30 years. And Russia was perhaps less articulate, less outspoken about this in the initial years. Perhaps there was a desire also to come to terms with the West, perhaps to come to an entente with the West, which did not happen. So the mistrust within Russia, the feeling of negativity on all that has happened has grown. And Mr. Putin has in many ways personified that, and he has perhaps given it more energy, more fire, more soul perhaps. But how is this going to serve the Russian interest in the long run is what we have to see.
So you're saying that that Putin made a mistake by crossing the line, by crossing the border and invading Ukraine?
Well, I certainly would term it a miscalculation. I really don't know whether he expected things to really pan out the way they have over the last 4 to 5 days. Ukraine is a nation of more than 40 million people. They are going to put up resistance. This is not going to be a walkover. This is not, obviously, we've seen that. And it may well be a long, drawn-out struggle. You may even have insurgency there. So has Mr. Putin landed himself in a situation from which it will be difficult to extricate Russia is the question. And we, in India, being well-wishers of Russia, certainly do not want and would not have wanted this kind of an outcome from all these unfortunate events that have taken place.
Now, some have been very critical of the sanctions that the Western nations have imposed on Russia, led by the sanctions against President Putin himself, his close circle of advisors. There are measures that are being taken to undermine the Russian economy. The ruble has crashed, as you know, the stock market hasn't opened. Now, would you say, as some have said, that this is almost like an act of war?
As far as what the West has done. Well, what you've seen is that the West has closed ranks. They have literally circled the wagons as far as Russia is concerned. And I think one had expected to a large extent that if Russia did cross the border into Ukrainian territory and war would ensue, today I think what you're seeing is essentially a war that is being played out, you would have expected the reaction from the West to be, completely in a sense, an expression of what Western power can do in the face of such action, which they term as enemy action. So you have, that they've used sanctions in the past. You know the way they've used financial instruments to deal with adversaries and enemies. You know the way they have blacklisted leaders from adversary countries and enemy countries. So altogether, Russia's actions have engendered what we, in a sense, could have seen coming, because there is a sense of deja vu about the kind of steps that the West has taken. But everything has kind of telescoped today before us in what I can only call a perfect storm from both sides.
But clearly, Putin didn't see it coming. So would you say, you've described him as a leader with flawed hubris. It sounds to me that you're saying that he seems to have lost the plot.
Well, in Greek tragedy, you use the word hubris, and you think of leaders who are maybe heroes of the story, but who are fatally flawed. So the question is, when I use the word flawed hubris, I put it in that sense. It is a great tragedy for Russia. Russia, already a country that has faced numerous tragedies in the past. Today, I think the Russian people have been placed in a situation as a result of these actions, which can only do no good to them, really.
Now, Russia's actions have divided the world, as it were, but it seems as if Russia is increasingly isolated, and countries like Cuba, Venezuela, China are now amongst the very few that are supporting Russia. So do you feel that this isolation of Russia in the international arena is going to worsen the situation inside the country, inside Russia?
Well, the sanctions are certainly going to create problems within Russia. I mean, we all know, although the Russian economy had done well in the last few years, but the fact that Russia depends on energy exports, most of its wealth, its foreign exchange reserves come from that. It's not from the export of technology. Of course, defense exports also constitute some proportion of that kitty. But today, in an atmosphere, global sanctions, or one could say Western sanctions, often operate across the various parts of the globe in a universal way. That is certainly going to impact Russian well-being and the state of the Russian people, and also the stability, I think, essentially, of the Russian state, because you have a war that is being transacted in Ukraine. You have the increasing isolation of the country. And all the fallout of this situation, much of which we cannot really plot on a graph with great accuracy, but we know the direction in which it would go, which could not certainly be good for Russia. So whether it's keeping the company of Cuba, which has been isolated for a long time, or Venezuela, which is, what a state that country has been in over the last few years. Now, we are not keeping the company of these countries or anything like that. That is not what I mean. The fact that we abstained on these resolutions and we gave an explanation of vote also,
I'm going to ask you about the India abstention in a second, but I just want to drive home the point or ask you, now, if this leads to greater instability inside Russia, then perhaps the leadership or Putin's leadership himself could be at stake.
Well, that has certainly been speculated upon by many analysts and observers in the last few days. And one certainly, in this scenario, nothing can be ruled out. Anything is possible. So we really don't know if what has happened in the last few days, and it's been a complete state of flux, bordering on chaos, what the impact of that will be on the leadership of Mr. Putin and his authoritarian hold on the Russian state. One really can't say, because there are the kernels, let's say, of great uncertainty in the days ahead for the Russian state structure, the leadership makeup of the Russian state. One can't rule that out.
So, ma'am, can I ask you about India's position now? India abstained twice at the UN Security Council, and both times we talked about how the crisis must end, the war must end, dialogue must take place. We know all of that. But to find India in the company of China and the UAE, but China especially, and India and China have been hostile neighbors, at least for the last 2 years since Chinese troops tried to walk across the line of actual control in Ladakh. Do you think this is odd for India, the largest democracy in the world, not to stand up on the side of Ukraine, but to stand up on the side of the aggressor?
Well, I think abstention has traditionally been the comfort zone for us when it comes to situations like this. It's not the first time that we've abstained in situations of this kind, although the example of what is happening today perhaps has dimensions which perhaps earlier situations did not entirely have. For instance, the invasion of Ukraine suddenly has become, it's as if the world is turned upside down. It has been such a polarizing development. And the divisions, the fault lines it has exposed, I think you couldn't really cite similar examples of what happened, let's say, where Libya was concerned, or even with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. So this seems to be a unique situation in some ways, but be that as it may, we took a kind of a middle path. Traditionally, our diplomacy has been, has favored the middle path. It's been very much a part of our tradition. And given the close partnership that has endured with Russia, even if it has become much more transactional, I think, in recent years than it ever was in the past, and we've had this comprehensive global strategic partnership that we developed with the United States, our very our proximity towards the Western democracies today is far more pronounced than it was ever in the past. So in that sense, the alignments are a little different, again, to cite the difference between, at the end of the Cold War and where we are today. So the fact that we abstained and then explained, of course, that we wanted peaceful solution, we wanted sustain.
To be in the company of China, your hostile neighbor.
Yeah, the company of China. Well, I think in this sense, I don't think we should say that we wouldn't have abstained because China was going to abstain and we would be in the same country. Well, we've been consorting with China in the Russia-India-China, trilateral also. This is after what happened in Galwan and all the confrontation and tensions that we've seen on the line of actual control in Ladakh. So I don't think we need to apply very sort of mechanical definitions of what could have been or what could not have been. But when it comes to explaining our decision to abstain, I think we could have been, in my view, much more forthcoming, and also in public statements that government spokesmen or...
To say what? That Russia is the aggressor?
Say that issues like territorial integrity and sovereignty, which we did mention in one of the but we could have elaborated on that, because that has been an article of faith for us as far as our foreign policy is concerned. And we have respected, recognized, and stood by the sanctity of international borders being respected and being always adhered to. It's a kind of discipline. It's a kind of, we've marched to the beat of that drum always. So I think we could be more explicit, and we could have also, in a sense, spoken out in terms of what the Russian actions mean for the future of the world order, for nations such as ours. I think it need not have been an official statement. It could have been a speech that one of our government...
To say what? To say what, for example?
To elaborate what our perspectives are about the developing situation between Russia and Ukraine, of course, positing it in the context of the close relations we've had with Russia, why we've stayed close to Russia, why it's important that that partnership should continue, but why we are concerned also by Russia's actions vis-a-vis Ukraine, and the death and the destruction that is raining down upon Ukrainian cities, upon Ukrainian people, the civilian population, the refugees that are streaming into neighboring countries, the safety of our own people there. So what more brings in such situations? I think we could have been a little more explicit, because at the moment we've been rather, economical with all the words that we've been used. We've been, I think, we have, in a sense, it would be, electing to stay on the other side of caution, not even caution, perhaps even, perhaps on the side of over-cautiousness.
Do you think this will affect the fact that you've been quite parsimonious about your explanation? Do you think that this could affect your relationship with the US and with other nations in the West, but particularly the US, with whom you have a huge trade, a much bigger trade than you have with Russia, for example, more than $120 billion annually. I think with the Russians, it's under 10 billion. But do you think it might affect your relationship with the US?
Oh, the other thing I felt, this is particularly a time where our relationship with the United States should acquire even more importance for us, just as it did after Galwan, the way we moved closer to the Quad, and the way our partnership with the United States has been growing, has been nurtured, even with changes of administration and governments in both countries. And the fact that the ballast in this relationship, the weight and the significance and the substance of this relationship is so much more textured and richer than what we have with Russia today. Today, when you speak of Russia, you talk of, trusted strategic partnership, but it's basically a lot to do with the defense relationship that we have. 70, a little more than 70% of our defense equipment, our aircraft, our submarines, our tanks, they're all of Soviet or Russian origin. And I was just listening to Shekhar Gupta's Cut the Clutter on this, which gave a wonderful exposition of the statistics involved in this kind of defense connections that we have with Russia. But the irony of the fact is that, while we have aircraft and ships and frigates and things from Russia, we also source, our product support from Ukraine. So what is going to happen now, with, for instance, all the Antonov aircraft are manufactured in Ukraine, and we have a substantial amount of them within our Air Force transport fleet. So it raises questions also for us about how our Atmanirbharta in defense production has really proceeded. Now it's been over 15 years since the nuclear deal with the United States was agreed upon. And things moved very slowly after that. Our problem, I think, this question of abstention, this question of what is happening in Ukraine, I hope will induce a much more serious introspection within ourselves as to why we've moved so slowly on these things. Our dependence on Russia has stayed where it was, literally, despite the fact that so much has changed in global affairs, so much has changed in terms of our foreign policy alignments. But in some senses, we've been glacially slow when it comes to diversifying our sources of defense imports, and also, of course, our defense production within the country. I think our Navy is perhaps doing a little better than the Army and the Air Force on this. But the fact is, I'm sure when we abstained on the resolution, all these things must have been weighing on our minds. So I can understand where India is coming from on this. I don't dispute you.
But can I ask you, you've been ambassador to the US, that country quite well. Do you think that the Americans must be somewhat aghast and say, like, what the hell happened? We have such a good relationship with the Indians. And suddenly they've gone and abstained, of course, formally, but in a sense that demonstrates support for Russia.
Well, I'm sure we must have been in touch with our American counterparts. Our government must have been, in order to explain, the situation and the circumstances in which we took that decision. I'm definite. There is that amount of mutual confidence and trust, very deep trust in that relationship. I'm sure we must have explained that. And the Russian and the Americans have been somewhat, I think, restrained in their reactions. But the other aspect of it is that within Congress and within the public space in the US, there are certain stereotypical views about where India comes from, our closeness to Soviet Russia and then to the Russians, and the fact that within the United Nations, our record of voting has been much worse than even some of America's adversaries. So those feelings persist, and that is something we have constantly had to contend with over the years. Now, that feeling may be even more pronounced now because the situation in Ukraine having acquired such serious ramifications, I'm sure all these decisions of various governments then also come under the microscope in the United States. But whether it's going to affect the trajectory of our relations with the United States, I wouldn't say. I wouldn't say that we have stormy days ahead when it comes to India-US relations. I wouldn't say that. I think the challenge before the government is to keep the channels of communication with the US open and to constantly, ensure that there is that clarification, that not that we are bound to give these clarifications, but to make it known to the Americans that where we are, where we're situated, there are certain constraints under which.
So China well, you've been ambassador to China. Now, what's the message from Russia's invasion of Ukraine? What's the message to big countries like China? Chinese troops are sitting on the LOC in Ladakh. Tomorrow morning, could Comrade Xi Jinping, the president, after his morning cup of tea, can he sort of say, okay, let me cross the line of actual control and come into India?
Well, that recalls something I read last year when we spoke of Russia and China becoming much closer as they are today. And they talk of a limitless partnership. That's what the last communique after Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi Jinping met had mentioned. But the feeling, I think, expressed in the strategic community is that Russia, I'm not saying it came from India, but in the larger, strategic community across especially in the West, was that Russia has the capacity to turn rogue. This is the words used. But China is not that kind of a country. It doesn't turn rogue that easily. It's not expected to turn rogue. And it's often seen as a peer of let's say, the US, for instance. It's seen as a global power that has arrived and that is wanting to take the front position. And that's where all the rivalry and the competition and the confrontation between the US and China comes from. Now, yes, Chinese troops are stationed right across our long border / line of actual control in many areas with India. I mean, China and India are facing each other almost eyeball to eyeball along that border. The question is China going to take a cue from what Russia is, and is it going to engage in similar maneuvers, some may call it, in similar rogue behavior, not my words, against India. Now, I doubt very much if that is going to happen. The situation of tension and confrontation and potential conflict between India and China along the line of actual control is bound to continue. I don't see that changing. But there are also reports that the way things have panned out in Ukraine with the Russian campaign over the last 4 to 5 days it has given China some cause to reflect on what its position or all that it has been saying about how Russia had been provoked and that Russian actions have to be understood in that context. I think there are perhaps also moves by the United States to reach out to China at this point of time to seek some kind of understanding, some level of understanding. The Chinese may not bite so easily, but I'm sure they're quite pleased with the fact that the Americans are now trying to seek them out, trying to see how Russia can be fully isolated on what it is doing. So the challenge now before us, if you ask me, is how this is going to develop. The China-US kind of connections that could not be re-established. They were never broken or severed in that sense. But how the lines could become active, much more active than they were in the last couple of years. That could happen. And in that sense, in the Indo-Pacific, what we're trying to do in the Quad and what the US was trying to do in AUKUS, those lines of confrontation may perhaps become a little less distinct because of the concentration on the European theater and what is happening in Ukraine.
But that's interesting, Ambassador, because that would seem that there is a rejig of what the Americans are thinking now. Earlier, we heard that China was a primary adversary. But if what you're saying is correct, then China is no longer a primary adversary. In fact, the G2 compact between the US and China is re-emerging, and Russia becomes the primary adversary.
Well, yeah, Russia is certainly the primary adversary. It is the focus of concentration, Western concentration at the moment. And therefore, Russia becomes, words used, secondary strategic, China becomes the secondary strategic direction. I really don't know whether one should put it in such stark terms and where it's so black and white. It's not exactly like that. But the fact that the invasion of Ukraine has occurred and the West has reacted the way it has, and the seriousness with which the West has taken Russia's actions and all the concomitant steps taken after that would mean that you can't fight on both fronts, literally. It's just makes strategic common sense, let's say, to try and seek to diffuse levels of tension on one front if you have to concentrate on the other. So, of course, the whole issue of Taiwan remains, but I don't think a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is the way, things will happen. I don't think that's imminent. In my view, it's something that the Chinese perhaps would keep up their sleeve, a kind of a chip that they will never let go of. But Taiwan, is for instance, it's a semiconductor superpower. Do you want to just overrun it? Do you want to sort of, attack it with
right.
your military might and civilian deaths and overrun the island, but what is going to happen to international supply chains? There's so much at stake there. So from both sides, I think there will be efforts to try and see how they can, keep the lid on these tensions and not allow them to let off steam, literally, to create some escape valves. Now, what that means for us in terms of our confrontation with China, I'm afraid it comes back to the same sad conclusion that these are battles for us to fight alone. That is the India-China confrontation.
So you don't think you can count on the US or the Russians, on the other hand, to be able to help you fight this battle with the Chinese?
Well, as far as the Russians are concerned, they are going to be at 6s and 7s for quite, I think, an indefinite period at least. It's not going to, everything just, you don't put Humpty Dumpty together so easily again. But the fact is that...
and the US?
As far as the US is concerned, given the state of our partnership and given, all the military strategic connections that we have made with the US, there will be obviously some material support in terms of intelligence, support in terms of equipment. But in terms of, with all the preoccupations that have been induced now by the Ukraine situation and the fact that the connections to China will have to be kind of operated in a way that we don't have, at least the US doesn't have too much of a problem to deal with in that part of the world, in East Asia, in the Indo-Pacific, is something you may very well see. I think the concentration is going to be on Russia. How are you going to induce further isolation? You have countries like Japan, former Prime Minister Abe is suggesting that nuclear weapons should now be stationed on Japanese soil. I mean, that is like, a complete sea change in Japan's attitude, its pacifist attitude post-World War II. Even though the ASEAN has issued a fairly, anodyne statement on the Ukraine situation, countries like Singapore, for instance, and followed by Indonesia, are prepared to take a much more strong approach, which is critical of Russia. So everything is up for now, I think. Everything is in a state of churn. To use a Sanskrit word, the manthan is really going on.
Well, we'll have to leave it there, but Ambassador Nirupama Rao, thank you so much for your time and for your views on this evolving situation in Ukraine. The war is not over yet, not by a long shot, but we will be watching very closely over the next few days and weeks how this unfolds. Thank you again, ma'am, for your time.
Thank you so much, Jyoti. Thank you.